Hey everybody, welcome to another week of 2100. This is going to be Module 6, talking about nutrition, dietary considerations. I wanted to take a little bit more of a athletic approach with this, so we're going to talk a little bit more specific about nutrition for athletes, as well as a couple different aspects of macronutrient consumption for athletes that you should probably think about. And this is all going to be kind of under the pretext or the guise of an introduction to nutrition. You're going to take 3305, you're going to take 4460 or 4450. There's several classes that you're going to have in the Kines program where we're really going to talk about nutrition. So this is just an intro level discussion of nutrition, but it still is going to give you a pretty solid basis moving forward. So before we really can go too far, we have to talk about the three primary macronutrients. So first off, we're going to have carbohydrates. Those are going to be 4 calories per gram. Carbohydrates are essentially just a glorified sugar molecule. They're all chains. They're all based off of the chemical structure of C6H12O6, which is glucose. Next one you're going to have is proteins. Again, those are 4 calories per gram. This is going to be comprised of amino acids, and then you're going to have fats. The fat is going to be about 9 calories per gram. If you ever look at the back of nutrition labels, you can see how many grams of carbohydrates, how many grams of protein, how many grams of fat there are in a food or in an item that you're buying at the store. Just multiply each one of those by these numbers right here, and then it'll give you a general idea of about how many calories that meal or that snack or that supplement is going to have in it. It would be remiss to not mention that there is probably technically this fourth consideration for a macronutrient, and that's going to be alcohol. And alcohol is actually 7 grams or 7 calories per gram. So there's been some research where they've actually tried to supplement with alcohol in the diet because it is calorically dense. I mean, it's almost double what carbs and proteins are. Only problem is it's essentially nutritionally empty. With it just being alcohol, you're not doing much other than becoming inebriated. So why do we care? Why do athletes care about what they're eating? Why do athletes specifically care about the macronutrient proportions that they're consuming in their diet, about how much protein they're getting, carbohydrates, fat they're getting in their diet? Well, if we're talking athletes, then we're also thinking along the lines of performance. And if you remember from our talks this past week, or I guess it was 2 weeks ago now, where we were talking about the U-shaped curve of sport and the health versus unhealth aspects of sport, some of the dietary considerations also start moving into this realm as well. So the first reason that athletes really care about nutrition is for energy for their sport, or energy for their training, or energy for their competitions. 2 primary sources of energy for athletes are going to be their carbohydrates or their fats. Loosely and very minimally, there's going to be some protein that's going to be fueling exercise. The goal, as you'll see later, is to essentially make this number 0. But we want the overwhelming majority of our energetic demands being met by our carbohydrates and our fats. There's 2 really main ways that we can fuel exercise with carbs and with fats. We'll talk about those in a couple of slides. But what I want you to know is that these are where we're going to be getting the majority of our energy from for sport. So in order to get energy, we have to make energy. In order to get energy from macronutrients, we have to make that energy, right? First system is going to be the phosphagen system. That's going to be an energy system that is responsible for quick hitting energy. Then we're going to have the glycolytic system, and we're going to have the oxidative system. Each one of these gets a little bit different and nuanced in terms of whether or not they're using macronutrients and how much energy they're actually producing, as well as their time domain. And we have to talk about why or how we make energy in order to talk about why we eat the way we eat. So first off is going to be phosphocreatine system, or PCR or CRP. It doesn't really matter what you call it. It's the creatine phosphate system. It involves a phosphocreatine molecule, an adenosine diphosphate molecule, and we make energy off of those 2 molecules. Essentially, our muscles store and hold phosphocreatine as almost like a potential energy source, if you will. That phosphocreatine system is stored in amounts enough for about 5, maybe 10 seconds worth of total energy output. It's not much energy, but it's enough to kind of fuel those quick hitting sprints. It's enough to fuel getting away from a lion if a lion comes running into the room really fast. What's really neat about phosphocreatine system is it doesn't require a specific macronutrient. But with that, we can actually augment and improve our phosphocreatine system by supplementing with creatine monohydrate. And there's a ton of research on that. If you guys want to talk more about it, feel free to reach out and we can talk about creatine supplementation in depth as well. Second main energy system we talked about in a couple slides ago was glycolysis, or the glycolytic system. Glycolytic system is the first step in which we actually start breaking down a macronutrient to fuel energy. Realistically, it's still not a very powerful method for making energy, but it's quick. We can make some energy from it, but it's quick. It's relatively fast, but we burn through it relatively fast as well. The process of glycolysis, you start with a sugar molecule, or a C6H12O6, a sugar, and you break it down into one of two products. You're either breaking it down into something called pyruvate, or you're breaking it down into something called lactate. If we end up making that lactate, then it can get shuttled back to the liver to make more carbohydrate. And this is also the much maligned concept of lactate, or lactic acid. And again, if you have more questions, we can dive into that a bit. You'll go over it more in 4450. Pyruvate is going to be a molecule that kind of is a transition molecule, if you will. It's going to allow us the ability to make more and more and more energy than we would normally be able to with just glycolysis alone. And it kind of serves to transition between two different energy systems. Now, here's where that transition step of that pyruvate comes into play. Realistically, your major energy production system is going to be from the next two slides. It's going to be from citric acid cycle, or Krebs cycle, in our electron transport chain. Together, these two systems combine to be our aerobic metabolism. That means in the presence of oxygen, we're going to be making more and more and more and more ATP. We're able to produce large quantities of ATP. Something that's really neat about the aerobic energy system is this is where carbohydrate burning and fat burning really meet. This is where we actually start burning fats for fuel as well. So if we're looking at these systems, the phosphocreatine system, it doesn't require a macronutrient input. Glycolytic system requires the input of carbohydrates, but not of fats or of proteins, really in appreciable amounts. It's this starting of the Krebs cycle, which is where we start burning fats and using fat for energy, and even start plugging in a little bit of protein if we need to, is going to be occurring. And then here is where all the energy gets made for the aerobic system, or the combination of Krebs cycle and electron transport chain. So it's actually at this step of electron transport that we're going to be producing large amounts of energy. So we need to have an input of energy from carbohydrates or from fat to get large quantities of ATP, or energy molecules. The overarching concept that I want you guys to take away from these 3 slides is that, or 4 slides, whatever the heck it is that phosphocreatine produces ATP fast, but doesn't need any macronutrient input, and we can supplement with creatine monohydrate to improve that. Glycolysis is where we burn carbohydrates or sugars, and then the aerobic system, the combination of Krebs cycle and electron transport chain, is where we can start burning fats and continue burning carbohydrates and start plugging in protein in little amounts if we need it. What happens when you don't have time to eat before you train? What happens when you don't have time to eat before you compete, or you don't have time to consume food right before a lion comes running through the door? Are you going to be able to have enough carbohydrate or fat or protein to use for fuel to get away from that lion, to prepare for your competition, to actually compete? The answer is mostly yes. Our body has the ability to store carbohydrates and fats in relatively large quantities. So carbohydrate, our total energy storage for carbohydrate is about 2,000 calories worth of energy. So it's a decent sized gas tank, but it's not virtually limitless, right? It's almost like tossing some sort of gasoline on a fire or continuing to pour gasoline onto the fire. Eventually you run out of that gas. Whereas fat is virtually a limitless supply of energy inside of the body. We have well over 100,000 calories worth of stored fat on our body for the average size individual. If you're overweight or obese, you have even more. And this stored fat is what you think of, right? It's the fat around our stomachs, around our hips, around our thighs, around our arms. All those storage sites for fat are actually storage sites for energy for fat. So what about protein? We just talked quite a bit about carbohydrates. We just talked quite a bit about fat. But we haven't really mentioned what are proteins doing? Why does a human care about what protein they're consuming? Is it to get arms like this guy? No, because this is an illegal drug called synthol that he was injecting into his muscles, not just eating correctly. So amino acids are the constituents of protein. So they make up proteins. Amino acids are essentially the thing that makes a protein. There's certain types of amino acids. There's essential amino acids, which are amino acids that our body cannot produce, and we actually have to consume them from food on a daily basis. And then there's non-essential amino acids. And these are going to be the amino acids of the proteins that our body is able to naturally produce. Essentially, what we want to happen with our protein consumption is we want our protein consumption to be at a level that favors protein synthesis and not protein breakdown. So we want to be at a level of protein intake that we are consuming enough protein to be growing and building and serving as a foundation instead of breaking down our proteins and putting them into energy systems and being in a negative energy balance. So when we actually consume protein in high enough levels that we're producing more proteins and we're building muscle and we're using it as a building block, that's called anabolism or anabolic. This is why things like anabolic steroids have the term anabolic, because it's increasing the protein synthesis. So that is anabolism means synthesis is outweighing or is greater than the breakdown of proteins. Catabolism is literally just the opposite. So it's where our breakdown is accelerated or it's beating out our synthesis. We're actually losing protein at a rate faster than we're making proteins or we're building proteins. This is a great example of this is age-related sarcopenia or age-related muscle mass loss. So as you age, you're going to lose muscle, and that is a chance for catabolism to be occurring. That's when catabolism is occurring. It's when protein breakdown is occurring at a faster rate, or is it greater than protein synthesis or protein building or muscle building. Clearly, we want to be at a level where we're in an anabolic state, not in a catabolic state. So if that's the case, what's the protein level required to either maintain protein status or to actually reach over into the anabolic setting? Well, if you want to just maintain, if you want to be at a static level where protein synthesis is equal to breakdown, or anabolism and catabolism are kind of neutralized and you're kind of in a flat status, you're going to want to go for about 0.8 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight per day. So that's what's called an RDA, and that is the level that's required to make sure that 80% of the population is meeting adequate thresholds. So that tends to be about 10 to 35% of your total energy intake coming from protein. Now that's going to be significantly different than that of an athlete. Athletes have increased stress, they have increased resistance, they have increased forces that they have to produce. So the level of protein that an athlete needs to consume is going to be dramatically different. In general, a good rule of thumb is about 1.8 grams of protein per day per kilogram of body weight. But as you can see over here on the left-hand side, you can actually have a range of protein intakes for athletes. And they can vary based on endurance, strength trained, intermittent athletes, that type of stuff. Carbohydrates, we all know, can be incredibly addicting. Just look at, have you ever been able to open a pack of Oreos and eat just one? Probably not, right? So carbs are going to be utilized based on various intensities throughout the body and intensities of workload. So if you remember when we were talking about the heart, and we were talking about heart rate thresholds, and we were talking about target heart rate zones, I told you that at low intensities we're burning fat, and at high intensities or high target heart rates we're burning more carbs. And that's exactly what you can see over here on the left hand side. You can see that as carbohydrate oxidation or carbohydrate burning increases, it's actually because we're increasing the intensity. So carbohydrates, because of where they come in for fueling at glycolysis, because they're able to be burned faster, they actually are being burned at a higher rate as we increase intensity, because we need more and more energy faster and faster and faster. This chart is actually something that I built, myself and one of my friends built for a textbook chapter that we were writing on carbohydrate needs for the athlete. And if you look, you can actually see that each one of these guideline groups, so this is the dietary guidelines, nutrition and menu standards, International Society of Sports Nutrition, American College of Sports Medicine, each one of these is recommending something a little bit different in terms of how many carbohydrates to eat per day. It's just adding to the confusion, but what I want you to really pay attention to is carbohydrate needs are going to vary significantly based on the individual. If an individual doesn't need a bunch of carbs, they shouldn't be eating them. If they need a bunch of carbs to fuel their exercise and fuel their activity, then go ahead, give them the carbs. But it needs to be something that is titrated in based on matching the activity level of the individual. As I'm sure you guys are all on social media, you've probably been able to tell based on really the past couple of years of nutrition data that carbohydrates are really a embattled topic. And largely what you get is two different camps. You get pro-carb individuals and you get anti-carb individuals. So what we know is that carbohydrates are highly recommended for sports performance from most nutrition organizations. But on the flip side, we also know that carbohydrates are not required by humans whatsoever, right? Like we can literally make all the carbohydrates that our body needs. We can produce them. We don't need to consume them. Yet we have sports recommendations and sports guidelines recommending we eat carbs. What's going on? Well, essentially, you have decades-long research that has been established showing that carbohydrates can help improve performance, but that's largely been done without studying the low carbohydrate environment and the low carbohydrate athlete. So really, it's not necessarily as black and white as people want to make it seem. It really is more mixed, and really truly it's not this one or the other, this versus, but it should be more of a concept of using both aspects, using high carb and using low carb to really optimize the performance of an athlete or optimize the health of an individual. So what about fat? Fat's got to probably be the number one most vilified macronutrient, right? Like we use the term fat derogatively when we're calling people names, and like it's got to be vilified for some reason. It's really not based on science though. What we know is that current recommended fat intakes are about 20 to 35% of calories coming from fat per day. Now, again, just like we have this kind of embattled carbohydrate situation, we have a very similar embattled fat situation going on. We have groups ranging from this low fat, high carb over here on the far left-hand side, all the way to high fat, low carb dietary recommendations, with most individuals kind of falling somewhere in between the middle. Realistically, both of these sides of athletes, both of these sides of diets have validity. Both of these sides of diets have scientific research in support and against them. What I want you guys to think about is, what is the athlete required to be burning? What type of athlete are we talking about? If you're working with an individual that's predominantly a sprinter, let's think 100-meter dash, 40-yard dash, small, short increments. does it really matter what macronutrient the individual is going to be eating? No, not really, because their energy source, their competitive energy source, is largely going to be coming from phosphocreatine system, which does not require any specific macronutrient input. What about like an ultra endurance runner? What about someone that runs for 100 miles at a time? Do we need to be consuming carbohydrates in appreciable amounts? Probably not, right? They're able to fuel their aerobic activity with fat. And to go one step further, they also have a large load, a large storage volume of fat on their body. They probably don't actually need to be consuming calories as they're exercising at the same rate as an individual who's consuming carbohydrates the entire time they're exercising. Both of those are really kind of like opposites of each other, if you will, right? One short distance, 10-second workout, 100-mile running. You can't really compare those two. It's not apples to apples, right? But if you drop into that middle, let's say you've got a soccer player. Let's say you've got a baseball player. Let's say you've got someone that's a mixed fuel sport. What should they be consuming? Well, you have to kind of start looking at what is the individual able to consume and perform at their best. Some individuals that you're going to work with in your career are going to respond better to low-carb, high-fat diets. Some of the individuals are going to respond better to high-carb, low-fat diets. Does that mean that either one of them is better or worse? No, not necessarily. It just means that you need to embrace both sides of the story to make sure that you have athletes performing at their best. What I want you guys to know is that the current climate of nutrition is incredibly embattled, right? The current climate of social media around nutrition is horrific. It is incredibly brutal. You have like verbal or text assaults across both parties of high carb, low fat, low carb, high fat, basically gunning for each other on emotional and interpersonal levels, not just talking about the science. You can see this at the dietary guidelines level. You can see this in health. You can see this in human performance. You can see this in like eating for specific diseases. Nutrition is something that is going to always be a struggle to get a consensus on, because essentially everyone and their mother has their own opinion on nutrition. It's a very accessible field. You can eat and control your food intake very easily, and you can control the way that you feel very easily with the way that you're eating. So it's going to always be something that is somewhat embattled. What you need to be doing as future professionals in the field of kinesiology is reading the research and being open-minded to different strategies to improve performance, improve recovery, and improve health.